getting really close to putting on the final panel on that 280 SL, which we've been working on. And the final panel is the inner wheel arch here. Now, before we put that on, we need to decide what we're going to paint it with. And what we're going to be using is the Eastwood 2K primer. And I'm going to just start this video doing a very quick intro, the difference between 1K primers, 2K primers, etch primers and normal primers. With etch primers, there's basically two types of etch primers. There's weld through etch primer. This is the built Hamber weld through etch primer. We've had excellent results with this. And etch primers basically have an acid in them, and they're designed to go onto bare metal, and the acid will eat its way into that bare metal and give you good adhesion for the primer and also good adhesion for the paint that goes on top of the primer. So you either get a straightforward etch primer, or you can these days get a weld through etch primer as well. So etch primers onto bare metal, and then you top coat them with some kind of urethane paint. Epoxy primers are probably about the best type of primer you can get. This is a 2K epoxy primer, which means it's a two-part primer, and this is the sort of stuff that body shops would use. And these days in these modern cans you get a special chamber inside here which you puncture, and then this mixes the primer together, and you've got about 8 on some cans, you've got 8 hours, on some you've got 48 hours to use the entire product. And what 2K primer means is that basically it has a hardener inside it. It doesn't air dry. A 1K primer like this, which is just a high build primer, basically 1K means it air dries, 2K means it's got another component inside there which will help it harden to dry. You can also get 2K primers which are not epoxy primers, and the difference between the two of them is this epoxy primer is basically a sealer. It'll create a complete moisture barrier, and you could put that piece of metal out in the elements and it won't rust, whereas the 2K non-epoxy primers are designed to be sanded and they'll basically fill gaps, etc. So you can buy a standard primer, either 1K or 2K. As I mentioned, the difference is whether or not they've got a catalyst in them to help the drying process. But the epoxy primer is not designed to be sanded. It's not a sandable primer. It's designed more as a sealant and a moisture barrier to go over a variety of different surfaces. Now, this stuff here is exceptionally durable, and you can put this onto bare metal surfaces like this. This is the lower kick panel for a Mercedes 107 SL. You can also put it over e-coat and other surfaces as well. Now, if you're going to put it on over e-coat, what you should be doing is getting yourself a green scuff pad and just scuffing the e-coat and then spraying it over, and that's the approach that we'll be taking. So we will be scuffing the e-coat both inside and outside, and then we'll be using this epoxy primer on that. At the same time, as I say, because this is stupendously expensive, especially in the UK, this is an American company, Eastwood, but they do make excellent products. This can here is about £37 here, much cheaper in America. I'm sure you can get other 2K epoxy primers, but I wanted to try this stuff here because we've had really good results with Eastwood. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this 2K primer on the last panel that we're putting on the car, the kick panel, which we'll be putting on at some stage, and we'll probably be repairing the front wing as well. So anywhere where we're going to be painting and need primer, we're going to be using the 2K epoxy primer. The last thing I'd say, if you are going to be using 2K primer, the epoxy primer, do not be tempted to get a cheap and cheerful mask like this. You need a proper respirator mask, because you do not want this stuff getting inside your lungs. This one here we got from Car Paint Warehouse, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video just to show what it cost and where we got it from. Having repaired all the holes that was causing water to leak into the footwell, I just sanded back some of the paint here with a view to painting it, and realised that there's lots of holy metal underneath there, so we've got to decide how to repair this. Now, I'm actually going to glue, using the panel bond, a patch in here that covers all of these holes, and then I'm going to sand this edge down flat so it's one smooth surface, because what we want in here is a completely waterproof solution, because this is a major runway for water all the way down here, and I don't have any possibility of it leaking. And also trying to cut a patch out of there and welding it on such thin steel is, I believe, fraught with danger by the time you've ground the welds down completely flat. So we're going to use panel bond to glue a patch in there. We just formed that patch. It's got a slight curve to it, and this bit here bends up, but this is 18 gauge steel, so it's quite easy to get into the correct shape. This patch is fitting perfectly in here. We've done it out of 18 gauge steel because we're going to be filing the end down here to make this absolutely smooth. You could also use a little bit of filler in there as well. It's absolutely sitting flush in there. That will ensure that we've got a beautiful waterproof runoff here. Then we'll just prime this and paint this up, and you'll never know that patch is there. We've finished all the welding on this car, and now we just need to seal these welds up with seam sealer, and we're going to be using this Dynax seam here, which we got from Built Hamber. Now it's important when you use seam sealer to use a proper seam sealer brush. These brushes are much stiffer than the cheap and cheerful ones that you might otherwise use. So we're going to seal up all the welds that we've done with seam sealer, then we're going to prime over that, paint everything, and then we're going to epoxy prime everything before we put this final panel on here. We're going to be scuffing this up with a scuff pad and painting it with the epoxy primer. We're going to be doing the same to the inside and the outside of this panel, and then we'll be top coating with Extreme Chassis Black, and then that will go on like this. This panel here is prone to rust, so we'll be giving it the absolute best coating that we possibly can, which is the epoxy 2K epoxy primer, and then we'll be just about done with this section of the repair. Similarly up here we'll be gluing that panel in. We've decided to glue this panel here as well with the 3M panel bond. We'll be epoxy priming all of that as well, and this will be as watertight as it's ever going to be. Just before we start spraying this up, I'm just test fitting it one last time. I'm going to mark exactly where it sits, and I'm going to sand all the paint off so that these edges are sitting on bare metal all the way round. The panel bond is quite forgiving, so if there are any small gaps in here, the panel bond will fill it and still create a waterproof seal. So I'm just making a note of where the clamps and magnets need to be to get that to sit perfectly flush against everything. Just going to give this a final wipe down before we prime it with this stuff here, once again from Car Paint House. That'll just take all the dust and grease off it and give the epoxy primer a good surface on which to adhere. We've masked off all the areas we don't want to prime on here. All the areas we don't want to prime have been masked off, and now we're ready to check out the Eastwood 2K epoxy primer. So it says shake for 2 minutes, take that red cap out, put it on the bottom, bash it down, shake for another 2 minutes, and then we're ready to go. So let's get shaking. So the next thing we have to do is take out this red cap here, and then we put it on the bottom like so, and we bash this thing down or push it down to basically puncture it. Okay, actuated it, we're shaking for another 2 minutes. I'm now intrigued to see how this thing performs and how it sprays. The 2K epoxy primer on this inner wheel arch support section is now dry, and we're going to set about top coating it with some Eastwood Chassis Black. This is ready to paint now. We're going to use the Eastwood Extreme Chassis Black because we happen to have a full tin of it, and that will give us good protection. It is a gloss finish. You wouldn't normally use the gloss finish here, but nobody's ever going to see this section here because there'll be the inner wheel arch support section covering it. So we're going to spray that first, because once we put the support section on, we won't have access to it anymore. So we're going to spray that and the inside of the support section with the Extreme Chassis Black. Everything painted with Extreme Chassis Black. We'll come back tomorrow and glue that final section in, and also the repair patch here, and then we'll just paint these bits silver, the color of the car, and that will be that section of this repair completed. Finally, so the next morning this has dried and come out really nicely. We're just going to take off all of our masking tape and then set about gluing this on to the car using the 3M panel bond. The one thing I should mention, that if you are using this 2K epoxy primer from Eastwood, you do not need to scuff the primer before top coating it. You've got something like a 3 to 4 day window before this is completely hardened, and if you top coat it in that window, you do not need to scuff it. If you top coat it after that window, you should scuff it with a scuff pad, something like a 220 grit scuff pad. Tape all came off absolutely fine. We'll just quickly go over the shiny metal edges once with a green scuff cloth, just to make sure that the 3M panel bond that we're going to put on there has something, a good rough surface to adhere to. Taking all the masking tape off there, leaving a bare metal surface on which to apply the 3M panel bond. Let's get on and do that now. It's about a week since we last used this panel bond. We used about half of it to glue that other panel in, so I'm hoping that I've got enough to do this job. And we used both of the nozzles on the last job, so I bought 10 extra nozzles. It cost about £8 or £10, something like that, hoping they're the right ones and that they'll fit. We'll soon find that out. So let's see if this stuff has gone off or that it's still usable. The moment of truth, is this stuff still good after a week? Let's check it out. Well, so far so good. Use a tiny little bit out, make sure it's coming out of both of those, which it is. It's coming out absolutely fine. I'm just going to spread that now into a nice thin primer coat. Got a thin primer coat on here. We'll do the same to the car. Thin primer coat all around where we're going to be gluing, and now it's time to put the thicker bead on the panel. So we put a much thicker bead on the panel here, and remember, with this panel bond here, you can slide the panels, but what we can't do is pull them apart. Okay, we've clamped this to the best of our ability. We're just going to go around and get rid of any excess glue. What you really want to do is see this squeeze out here, because it means you've got a good seal. We're just going to make sure that the seal is as good as it can be. This panel's not a perfect fit, so we've kind of overdone it on the panel bond at the bottom there, but it's looking pretty good. Next up, we're going to just panel bond that little patch that we've made in here. Okay, that panel there has been pushed down by these 50-kilogram pull neodymium magnets, and boy are they strong. I've clamped my fingers between a couple of them on a number of occasions, and it really hurts. So we have glued everything in. We're just going to go around, tidy up any excess glue, double check that everything's in the right place, and then go and have a cup of coffee. I'm going to end this video here, and what a long journey it has been since we repaired that brake pipe. We placed that brake pipe only to discover that the battery tray was rusty, and then taking the battery tray out, realising there were massive great big holes in the car. We can now lift this up and have a look at the extent of the holes below. It started us off on our welding journey. We've never done any welding before since We paired this. It led us to discover the 3M panel bond, which is a great product and I would thoroughly recommend it. And we've learned a whole host of new skills. The next video I think we're just going to be reconnecting the brakes, the bonnet hinges, putting the back padding back on there, putting the front wing back on, deciding whether to repair the wing at the bottom where it's slightly rusted. We'll probably have a go at doing that. And then another stage, at some later stage, I'm going to come back and do the lower kick panel, possibly replace the floor pans, and decide what we're going to do with the sills, whether we replace the entire sills, which is massively expensive, and it's also a huge project because getting the doors out of alignment is really easy to do when you do that, or we're just going to patch it. I haven't decided yet, but for the time being I'm quite pleased with what we've managed to achieve with just basic tools on this repair. We got the Eastwood Epoxy Primer from these guys here, Frost UK. It's super duper expensive, £34.99, but it is a great product, goes on easily and no need to sand it before top coating. If you're lucky enough to live in America, you can get this stuff for $27, $28, so it's much cheaper. We use these guys here, Car Paint Warehouse, to get a decent mask, seam sealer brush, and also the panel wipe or paint prep white. Seam sealer came from these guys here, Built Hamber, who also do that excellent rust removal crystals. We got the Extreme Chassis Black Spray from these guys up here, Moss in Bristol. You can also get it from Frost, but it's cheaper if you don't have to pay postage. You can get it on brush on, or you can get it spray on version.